Tamar is acclaimed academic and art historian, Durning Lawrence Professor in the History of Art at University College London. She graduated from the Michaelis School of Fine Arts, University of Cape Town. That was the first degree. She is South African, with a BA degree in arts and 2 MAs in arts education from the Institute of Education, University of London, and in art history from the Courtauld Institute of Art. Courtauld Institute of Art. Her PhD was also at the Courtauld Institute, where she began her lecturing career. Professor Garb's research interests have focused on questions of gender and sexuality, the woman artist and the body in the 19th and 20th century, as well as more recently, post-apartheid culture and arts in and from South Africa. She has published extensively with key publications that include The Body in Time, Figures of Femininity in Late 19th Century France, The Painted Face, Portraits of Women in France, 1814 to 1914, Bodies of Modernity, Figure and Flesh in the Fin de Siècle, France, and Sisters of the Brush, all about women, artists, and bodies and flesh. And so this one is Sisters of the Brush, Women's Artistic Culture in Late 19th Century Paris, all published by leading presses. Yale University is leading among her publications, and the titles are so beautiful. They sound just like how Tamar speaks. So she has curated the exhibitions Landmarks, Homelands, Contemporary Art from South Africa at Haunch of Venison, London in 2008. Another exhibition she curated, Figures and Fictions, Contemporary South African Photography at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London in 2011. And then finally, one of these is just a selection of a curatorial work. The one that I have picked here as the last one on the list is Distance and Desire, Encounters with the African Archives at the Walter Collection in New York, Ulm and Berlin, 2014 and 2015. Ladies and gentlemen, good people, let us give Tamar a hand of welcome. Thank you. I am sorry for that, ladies and gentlemen. You know, some of the habits refuse to go. I thought I was done with the ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much, Pumla. Thank you very much for your warm welcome. It's really wonderful for me to be here, to see some familiar faces and to meet some new friends. I have followed this project with great interest, and I was sorry not to be able to attend the first of these workshops, but luckily for me there is a good 6 hours of it online, and so I have immersed myself in the debate and discussion. And my contribution today really comes as a response to, I think, the kinds of questions that were posed at that first symposium workshop that you held, thinking about what it is to juxtapose these two momentous, you might say, and extraordinary periods of 20th century history and their afterlives. So thinking analogously. Now, what I don't have is my device for moving forward. You do that, Steve. Can you get to my first slide? Okay, thank you. So thinking with and through art is what I've called this in an overarching sense, because one of the things that I suppose I want us to open up to question today is the capacity of art itself to produce knowledge and a space of juxtaposition which has its own integrity and has its own way of being, its own epistemology, you might say. That when we think with and through art, we don't necessarily think like a historian might do or like a lawyer might do in a court of law, with a series of propositions and counter-propositions and a logical, deductive way of computing meaning. Meaning as generated with and through art operates by different means, by different languages. And one of those is through this idea of juxtaposition and analogy. So insofar as this whole project is a project which puts together two very distinctive historical formations, the Gulag on the one hand and apartheid on the other, what is it to ask them to coexist? Do we ask of them that they share certain historical languages, patterns of representations, patterns of thought, and patterns of experience, human experience, or do we look for the distinctions and the dislocations which will draw out the particularities of each? Now, art provides one of those spaces through which they can sit in what I like to think of as paratactic alliance. Parataxis is a figure of speech, is a rhetorical device where one puts unlikely things next to one another, and you allow them to rub up against one another in order to produce meaning. The meaning is not necessarily pre-given, the meaning is not necessarily pre-thought, but in the space of encounter, new knowledge potentially can be generated. And so what I would like to do with you today is to think in quite an open way about what it is, through the language of art, to put these two very, very distinctive historical experiences alongside one another. I'm going to talk for about half an hour, and then we're going to open up a conversation and then hopefully include members of the audience as well. Could I have the next slide, please? So what is it to think with an object? The object I'm going to focus on for quite a long time today is a very particular, very small painting. It's about the size of an A4 piece of paper, yeah, like a piece of printing paper from your machine. So imagine it as quite small. One of the things that I want to think about with you today is that when one thinks with, a little slower, okay. Yeah, just warn me because I can sometimes accelerate. When it's a matter of thinking with and through an object, attendance to the materiality of the object is absolutely crucial. Because the meaning of the object, thanks Pamela, I think that is better. The meaning of the object is not only iconic, the meaning of the object is also material. And one of the ways of attending to the physical materiality of the work of art is to pay attention to what composes it as a material object. So this little thing, as I say, A4, is made of wood. In fact, it's made on an old 19th century frame, old piece of wood from the 19th century. It's very important that you see the grain. It's made by sticking frayed pieces of fabric, hessian, onto this piece of wood in order to construct this tree. And then, as you will see, little flowers, collaged little flowers, and I'll talk a little bit about their origin in a minute, are placed onto the tree. Next, please. You will see that the back of the image, I want to show you the back of the image. So next, please, Caesar. Going forward. Yeah. This is the back of the image. Backs, for those of us as art historians, we are just as interested in the backs of objects as the front, because we're interested, a work of art is a material thing. It's not just something you find on Google Images, which is just a series of icons. It is a thing with weight. It is a thing that you can carry. It hangs, it's propped, it hangs on a wall, it's a thing. So the back of an object is very important, and this object at the back is extremely important because it shows us how the thing is made. You can see it's made up of component parts that are stuck together with tape. The tape itself has an inscription. It's got New York 11101 at the top. It's a piece of sticker tape made, a commercial piece of tape found in New York. So we have here a sense that the object is made in New York. It gives it a sense of place. And Vivian Kurland, who's the artist I'm going to concentrate on today, puts her label on the back, sticking it on, and you see that the object is called the Gulag Tree. Now, Gulag is a South African-born artist, currently resident in the United States. So she's a South African-American who is involved in multiple histories, and often the works function as these kinds of palimpsestic arenas in which the layerings of history from different spaces are composed and put together in unlikely juxtaposition, you might think. So we're going to go on to this idea of what an unlikely juxtaposition is and what it might help us to think with. Can you just give me the next detail, please? I want to show you. Okay, that just shows you the label, and the next one. Yeah, when you start looking now at the work and we enlarge it, you'll see that on this tree are little bits of newspaper. They come from the New York Times. So we're dealing here with a mapping of the world, which we're going to see has apartheid South Africa, the Soviet Union, and New York, where the artist is situated at the point of making, all cohabiting in this one small material object. And one of the ways in which this is signified is through the technique of collage. So Gulag often works with contemporary news items that come from newspaper clippings. And here you can see, it's enlarged. When you see the work, you have to look very close to read it. The Gulag, an acronym, camp, administration. Those are the words extracted from some bigger article made now to sit going up the bark of the tree. A very suggestive, you might say, collection of words. They make no logical, deductive, coherent sense. They would not stand up in a court of law. But in the arena and in the space of art, when we are in the space of aesthetic contemplation and epistemology, their juxtaposition is powerfully evocative. They don't tell you how to think or what to think. This is not a didactic practice, but they open up the possibility of thinking by placing these ideas next to each other. And it's very interesting. So the Gulag obviously has all sorts of resonances. The idea that it might be an acronym, I don't know, is it an acronym? The Gulag, it is. Okay, so maybe, Andrea, you'll explain to us later what the acronym is. I'm no Gulag expert. Camp administration. Now that I found very interesting because we think of the Gulag and prison camps, we think of the implementation of the Soviet regime through this orchestration of camps, and then that evokes the whole history of camps, and the whole history of camps in multiple situations. The origins of the camp, the notion of the concentration camp, the idea in this context of thinking of South Africa and the early camps of the early 20th century during what used to be called the Boer War, the South African War, the incarceration of the Afrikaner in those camps, the development of camp culture, the notion of bare life. There are lots and lots of ideas, depending on what we each bring to the work, which resonate with the notion of camp. In fact, one of the discussions at the last iteration of the symposium was on the idea of the township, the old South African township, as a kind of prototypical camp. Yeah? What is it to sequester people within certain kinds of boundaries, to limit movement, to construct limits on labour and on life, and to circumscribe life in those ways, and is that what constitutes a camp? So just through this tiny little sticker of a quotation, every single person will be able to think with the work and through the work in these ways. Can I have the next detail, please? I wanted to enlarge the little flowers that are on this Gulag tree, so-called. For those of you who are South African, you will immediately notice them as, recognize them as proteas. For those of you not from South Africa, there's some proteas in the back of the room. Caesar is showing us. And it's not coincidence that we happen to have proteas here, because protea is the national flower. It is indigenous to the Cape. The Cape has the most diverse botanical system in the world. The richest floral system in the world is in the fynbos of the Cape, and the protea is the paradigmatic flower of the Cape. Huge icon, symbolically very resonant, and a subject of great pride. But the protea also has its own rather fraught history. These particular proteas come cut out from little postcards, because one of the tourist images of South Africa traditionally was the postcard against the mountain of the protea, the national flower. Could I have the next slide, please, Caesar? So just to show you the kind of historical symbolism that the protea had, from the 1970s on the left, you have, this is in the heart of the apartheid era, the protea was used very often as the national stamp. Your postage stamp was emblazoned with proteas. Yeah, it was the pride of the local flora, and it came to be a national symbol associated at that point to some extent with white supremacy, because the protea also was the icon that identified certain sporting teams like the South African cricket team, who are still called the Proteas, and at this very moment that the protea is this great big proud symbol of South Africa, it's also the insignia that describes exclusively racialized white sports team. So it's a vexed and compromised symbol. It is not a neutral symbol. And for those of us who grew up, as I did in apartheid South Africa, I couldn't even at the time of growing up think that the protea was a beautiful flower. The protea was an ugly thing. It's taken me a long time to come around to being able to look at the protea as something which is part of the natural fecundity and beauty of this region and of the world. It is a vexed symbol for those of us who grew up here. And the way in which it is associated not only with national discourse, but white supremacy, still remains impacted in it as a symbol. Next, please. So, when you look at this Gulag tree, this inconsequential, apparently little object, and you see the inscription of the words Gulag on a frayed and torn tree, bearing this strange fruit, and I use those words very advisedly, you see that impacted in this little image are a huge number of historical and cultural references which bring together these disparate histories in one material and iconic signifier, which is rich and dense, not only in its semiosis, in the way it generates meaning through the image, but also in its materiality. It's made through a very physical way of sticking and pasting and putting together objects in these, you might think of poetic alliances and analogies. Next, please. Now, there is another little verbal inscription. Next slide. Here we are. In the top, oops, no, back, sorry, Caesar. Yeah. This bit here, I now am away from the mic, is there. Yeah? If you look at that over there, there's another little bit of text which says, the former Yugoslavia. That helps us to date this work to some extent. I mean, we know that Kurland dated it for us at the back. But if we're talking about the former Yugoslavia, and you're talking about the Gulag, and you're talking about the protea, you're looking back historically, and the work itself becomes a kind of dense archive in which different histories are collected. So the former Yugoslavia invokes the breakup of the Soviet Union and what happened after the dissolution of that order that the Soviet Union had kept in place, and in which the Gulag, of course, was one of the mechanisms of keeping that system, or at least the Soviet system of repression and censorship was one of the mechanisms of keeping that in place. So another thing that then becomes very interesting to think with is, of course, if we think about what produced the end of apartheid, there are many, many different historical narratives that will explain why and how apartheid ended. Was it the liberation struggle? Was it just the end of the road for white supremacy and capitalism in the way in which it was lived? Was it the end of the Cold War, 89, and the fall of the Berlin Wall, which meant that Britain and the US didn't have to prop up South Africa anymore, which they had done through the whole of the apartheid era? How do all of these come together to provide the circumstances through which apartheid is no longer a tenable social structure, or it's no longer worth the efforts, huge efforts, military and economic, of those powers like the United States and Britain to prop it up even though the struggle, of course, had been going on for so long. So how we understand the breakup of apartheid is often understood in conjunction with the end of the Cold War, the breakup of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the coming together of the liberation struggle and the efforts of people here, together with a world order, a global order, which produced a new kind of reality through which a new order could become to be established. So this little work is not telling us what to think. We have to bring to it a whole lot of other kinds of knowledge. These words might prompt all kinds of research. But it brings together the conjunction of all of these different possibilities, yeah, for thinking. It also brings together the idea that you are juxtaposing different forms of tyranny and different forms of oppression. Once you have the Gulag and Apartheid, as signified here by the protea, placed alongside each other, it begs the question. It asks the question, what did they have in common? Why can they sit together in one space? Is it about systems of tyranny? Is it about systems of oppression and censorship? Is it about the way that art in both the Gulag and Apartheid were taken seriously, so seriously that they were disallowed, and censorship became an absolutely crucial technology of continuing that social order? So, it asks us to think about that, as well as the cost to human life, to human dignity, to human freedom, to all the ways in which we understand what full human capacity is. So, this idea of juxtaposing different historical regimes, situations, realities, and posing the question of their analogous conjunction is, I think, crucial here. And next slide, please, Caesar. I just wanted to show you another example of an artist who I've worked with a lot, and I talked a couple of years ago when we had our panel here on trauma and afterlife. I talked at length about this photograph by Santu Mofokeng, one of the greatest of South African artist photographers. This is a photograph that Mofokeng made at Auschwitz, where he photographs himself reflected in the window, the vitrine of the Auschwitz Museum. And he sits there like a silhouette, a black shadow, that what you see in the picture is actually behind him, the museum behind him being reflected in the mirror. So it is a whole illusory image in which he implots his own silhouetted body in the Auschwitz Museum. Yeah? And I can talk at length about this another time. I'm not going to talk about it now because I don't want to take up that time. But it interests me because of the way in which it proclaims Mofokeng's presence in the face of the suffering of others. And I want to talk a little bit today about the concept of sympathy, which I'm going to come to as we go on. People usually use the concept of empathy. Empathy is the one that is now most available to cultural theorists. And the concept of sympathy, which goes back to 18th century philosophy and about which there's a lot to say, and we'll say some of it, I hope, in discussion. The concept of sympathy, which means being with suffering, being with pathos, being with pathos suffering, being with the suffering of others as like subjects, not as subject-object, not as observer-observed, but as like subjects in a conjunction of equal, in creating the terms for a social encounter in which people can be with the suffering of others. To me, this is an example of a kind of sympathetic alignment, but not an identificatory fusion, which would take one to empathy, potentially. A sympathetic alignment with the murdered and memorialized, who are actually physically behind him, but are here positioned like these little indeterminate squares in front. So we're going to come to talk about this. Next, please. It evokes a whole tradition within South African visual representation and aesthetic regimes of the juxtaposition of South Africa and South African apartheid and the Holocaust. I show you just one example of a film still from Alain René's famous film Night and Fog about the conditions within the camps. and Ben McLennan's famous image of miners and the way in which they are housed, and nobody needs to think very deep and far to understand the parallel ways in which the actual architecture of the sleeping environment produces a way of thinking that positions human life as in a certain way. Yeah. So there's something, when we think of the aesthetics of cruelty, you can think of the actual infrastructures, the architecture of environment as itself producing something which constitutes human life in a particular way. And so that we can think of these parallels. And the space of black and white recording is another aesthetic as well, and a set of aesthetic languages that help to produce those kinds of conjunctions. So there's a lot of literature and a lot of thinking about what it is to think with these kinds of disparate historical situations, but which nevertheless have formal infrastructural parallels which produce analogy. Yeah? Which doesn't mean they're exactly the same. Of course they're not. They're different historical situations. But it does open up and beg the question of where similarity can be sought. Next slide, please. Just another example from Kurland. I just wanted to show you that Kurland has worked throughout her working life with parallels between Holocaust imagery and South African situations. So she often works on recycled burlap. These numbers come from the burlap, which also, of course, invoke the tattooed marks on incarcerated people in the camps. But she works also with the South African Archive. That is a small little archival photograph of forced removals of people being sent to the Eastern Cape. She reproduces that. It resonates with trains and train lines and the whole vocabulary, the visual vocabulary of Holocaust imagery as well. So that is an old device. Next one, please. And Kurland works a lot with picking up quotations of things from archival sources. So this, for example, is a Gulag prisoner number. All she does in that work is just reproduce it, enlarge it, place it on a painting, recontextualize it. So one of the ways in which art produces different kinds of knowledge is to take stuff from the archive, extract it from the normal or usual situation in which it resonates and has meaning, and by recontextualizing, repurposing, defamiliarizing, asking us to attend to it differently. So when you realize that B1930 is the number assigned to a human being, same as in the concentration camps, then, and you see it enlarged on a painting, the question of what constitutes a human life, how it can be reduced to a number, how it can be enlarged and placed on an image, becomes one of the questions that the painting asks us to think about, even if it's not a didactic way of producing that. Yeah? It's an anti-didactic art, which is extraordinarily suggestive and poetic. And it comes to that part, I suppose, that understanding of the aesthetic and poesis as a means of making knowledge, producing knowledge, but without prescribing what is thought in the face of knowledge. And decontextualization and defamiliarization is one of those devices. Next, please. So back then to our little Gulag tree. Just quickly, this is a space for thinking together, for putting these histories alongside each other and trying to think with resonance, what happens when they resonate with one another. I'm going to show you another work, series of works that Kurland produced that also ask this question. So these are a series of objects called mute pianos that she made in the early 2000s. You can see they're made of wood. They are mute in the sense that they have no sound. They look like pianos. They have the piano keys. They're made very, very tactilely as material objects. And you look at them and you first might think, well, what on earth does this have to do with the conjunction of the Gulag and Apartheid? Yeah, we have these boxes made to look like pianos. But the source of these works in Kurland's oeuvre is very interesting. Next, please. And it's a very nice story, because often the way in which these conjunctions and juxtapositions work is not just because of some theoretical proposition or intuitive understanding that the artist has, but because of historical events or biographical events in the artist's life, which produces the conditions for this kind of juxtaposition. So this is the source of the image. This is a postcard. The postcard comes from the Riga Museum. Riga, for those of you who don't know, is the capital of Latvia, one of the Baltic states, was part of the Soviet Union. And the piano, this mute piano, was constructed in the 1950s for the Latvian composer Jānis Licitis, L-I-C-I-T-I-S, I don't know his work. He was incarcerated in one of the camps in the Gulag, and one of the things he did when incarcerated was to make a wooden piano, a silent piano, a mute piano. So once you have that knowledge, that opens up all sorts of questions. A composer making a piano, carving a piano out of wood in a camp, in a prison camp. Maybe he plays it imaginatively. Maybe it's a form of resistance against the stifling of creativity that the situation of the camps was meant to produce. And we know from the work of Andrea and others that in fact creativity in the camps was enormous. There were theatre groups, there were music groups, there were concerts. People in all sorts of circumstances find ways to express what is their humanity and to produce art in the face of terror. So we have this understanding then of this composer in the camp carving and painting and making his mute piano where you feel that the sound has been stopped. It's made mute. Okay. It's on a postcard because the postcard, this is the back of the postcard, next one please. The postcard was sent to Kurland in New York by another artist, a man called George Tobias, South African artist, a weird, wonderful, wacky, Dada South African artist who lives in London now. He was on an aeroplane, and they made a forced landing in Latvia because there was a storm. He had a few hours to spare in Riga. He went to the Gulag Museum, and he found this piano. When he saw the piano, he writes a postcard, "Dear Viv, just got halfway to my niece's wedding, got stuck here, will send you a brochure from this museum once back in London. The missing uncle," he's the uncle at the wedding, you see. So this marvelous thing of the postcard tells the story. And next one, please. Kurland then is totally fascinated by this image and decides to make her own mute pianos. So she makes, this is the first one she makes, in an old wine box. Bordeaux, Gironde, France. So we have another geography there. And you look at this object, can we have the next slide, please? You will see that it is made up of various elements, including a leather handle that she has placed on it. Yeah? She's stuck on it. Now, this leather handle is not just a coincidental object she had in the studio. It's the handle from an old leather suitcase that belonged to Kurland's grandfather. He held this handle, this very same handle. He was the violinist, the chief first violinist at the Cape Town Symphony Orchestra. He fled Russia during the pogroms, born in Ukraine, fled Russia during the pogroms, arrived in South Africa in 1917 as a penniless refugee. Most of his family were killed, and he then came just with his violin and a leather suitcase, and this is the handle, the indexical object itself that travelled to South Africa and is now incorporated into the Gulag, into the mute piano, which invokes this other history. So you have this interesting conjunction of things, personal, historical, that come together in this object. The historicity of these materials are brought together in this work of art. I'll show you some others. So Kurland then started to make, just flip through them quite quickly. There's a detail, you see VAK, Vivian Yasha Kurland, that's her initials. This is you see the texture of it. Next one, please. This is another version of it, Vivian Yasha Kurland. And here we have the juxtaposition of these two objects with which I've asked us to think together. So I want to, in the last few minutes that I have, think with the concept of sympathy, which I brought up right in the beginning. We can think of sympathetic alliance, usually it's between peoples, between histories, between situations, between symbols. This idea of a sympathetic alliance, the state of feeling together, it's sometimes described as fellow feeling. That's one of the ways in which it is described. And I said in the beginning, it's made up from the Greek word sym, meaning being with, and pathos or pathy, meaning suffering, being with suffering. As I said, it's got a very long philosophical pedigree. I've been looking at a volume this size on sympathy, and I can tell you can go back to ancient Greece, and you can go, and it's now, I think, the challenge is going to be to think sympathy in a non-Eurocentric way. And this is where we might open up the concept of Ubuntu as a South African and African-originated version of its own, with its own history. And Pumla, perhaps in our discussion, you might be able to enlighten us a little bit about how that might work. Because, of course, the history that we have of sympathy at the moment in terms of the kind of readers that we have, it's not used very much, actually, with people in aesthetics, because empathy has become the term. But I think there's a lot of potential to thinking with it, because it comes from not a self alone, but from being with others in the world. Sympathy and sociality are very, very interlinked. They're about the shared, independent, and mutual activation of feeling amongst all people, and about the capacity of all human beings to feel with and alongside one another. It's a capacity that makes humans human, according to Hume, and stems from this profound social instinct. And it's not about self-preservation. It's not about imaginative projection. It's not about a willed and consciously driven identification with others, but rather a recognition of mutuality in human society that is present from infancy and beyond. Now, I'm being signaled by Caesar that I have to stop. So there's lots more to talk about, but I'm going to stop there, and hopefully we can open up this conversation more in our discussion together. Thank you very much.